stuff, and I've made a number of videos about it, which you can check out in this playlist. But here's the gist. A scanning electron beam creates a pattern of light on the face of a cathode ray tube called a raster. This raster is a series of horizontal lines. Variations in the intensity of the beam will create variations in brightness as the line is drawn. By synchronizing the scanned raster of the television with the scanning raster of a television camera, we can instantly transmit moving images across the globe. All it takes is a television set and favorable receiving conditions. In the earliest days of television, all television was produced live. We didn't have a way to store television signals to be rebroadcast later. Eventually, we found that we could just adapt motion picture film for use in television, using devices called telecines and kinescopes. While perhaps a primitive and brute force way to go about it, these worked. All you needed to do was to film a television screen to capture it on film, and to rebroadcast it, you point a television camera at a movie screen and ta-da! Now, to be clear, it was a little less janky than that, but indeed, the principle was film a TV and broadcast a movie. But this was kind of annoying. For one thing, television was created using interlaced video, meaning we had a refresh rate of 60 Hz in the US. Typically, when stored on film, the frame rate would be cut in half to 30 frames per second, if not lower to 24, reducing the fluidity of motion. But the most annoying thing was that film is expensive. You can't reuse it, it takes time and effort to develop it, and in general it presented a limitation to television production. Enter videotape. The quadruplex recorder by Ampex was the first real success in this field. Suddenly we had a way to store the electronic signals of television electronically. By writing them directly onto tape, we'd have the full 60 Hz refresh rate. In fact, we'd have a literal television signal ready to be retransmitted at any time. And most importantly, the tape could be reused. Now television could be recorded earlier in the day, broadcast later that evening, and the same tape could be reused for the next day, much to the chagrin of archivists. But anyway, here's the key thing. Videotape is simply storing a television signal. And that television signal, unlike our friend film, is not a physical object made of microscopic silver crystals that we can see with our own eyes. Granted, the tape is made of microscopic particles, but they don't hold an image. It's just the television raster frozen in time, which means it does have a limited and defined resolution. That raster, that's as much resolution as you can ever have, and for NTSC televisions, like this one, that's only 480 lines. PAL countries got closer to 600 lines, but still, that's it. I'm going to stick to NTSC numbers from now on, so back to 480. Those 480 lines are sort of like the speed limit of analog television. Television is a technical standard, after all. You can't exceed 480 lines of resolution, or else you've made something that no television set can display. So if you're using a television camera, you've got those 480 lines. No more, no less. The best videotape will record the television signal almost verbatim, but that's still just, are you ready? 480 lines, which today we call standard definition. So anything that was mastered on tape will forever be limited to those 480 lines of resolution. We can't get any more detail out of it unless we start doing some goofy AI stuff. But film? That's an entirely different story. Film isn't an electronic signal following a technical standard, it's just a bunch of microscopic silver crystals. So even though we might have used film to make something for TV, if we still have the film, we can go back, transfer the film with modern technology, and suddenly have the same thing in much higher quality. When shooting with film, the result will be as sharp as the person could focus and as fine as the grain of the film is. This is why some older television shows, like Star Trek The Next Generation, are looking great into the 2020s. The producers of TNG had decided to shoot on film. Why might they do that? Well, while it would make production more expensive, it also gave them tons of flexibility in the editing. Because film has a high level of detail, you can crop the frame without impacting the quality as it appears on screen. But best of all, this decision paid future dividends. Thanks to shooting on film, we aren't stuck with a bunch of tapes in standard definition. We have the original film negatives that we can scan at modern resolutions and enjoy in the highest quality possible. But lots of television shows didn't go that route. It's easy to argue that, well, if we're making this for TV, why would we use film? If everyone's watching this on a standard definition television, What's the benefit of exceeding that quality, aside from maybe some freedom in the edit bay? And so, other shows like Star Trek Voyager shot directly to tape. Quick correction/clarification. The actual live action was shot on film, which in hindsight seems pretty obvious considering the refresh rate is definitely not 60 Hz. I haven't actually seen any of Voyager until now. Forgive me. The catch with Voyager was that the film was immediately transferred onto videotape, and all of the editing and special effects, so basically the entirety of post-production, were done on tape at NTSC resolution. Anyway, which in fairness didn't matter at all back in the day since it was only seen on the tube TVs of the day. In fact, you might argue it was better than film since you had a true 60 Hz refresh rate again, if you like that sort of thing. But that decision means we cannot improve the quality beyond how it was in 1995. It's stuck that way forever. The video is hard-coded onto magnetic tape, either in the analog domain or, in later years, in the digital domain. And there's literally no room for improvement. If it was shot in standard definition it shall forever be. And so that music video, it was simply shot on this stuff. While nobody saw it on film back in the 80s, at least aside from the people doing the editing, that film was always there in storage somewhere, ready to be transferred a second time using today's technology. And now that it's been done, it's blowing everybody's mind. So, how can you tell if something's been shot on film versus tape? Well, first of all, if it wasn't produced for television, as in if it's a movie, it was shot on film. Digital cinema wasn't viable until the 21st century, so if it's a movie from the 90s or earlier, that's film. And this is why so many old movies have been reissued on Blu-ray with great results. We have the film prints to scan in HD or even 4K, unless of course they've been lost. Now, if it was produced for television, the easiest thing to look for is the soap opera effect. This is the name given for the oddly smooth motion commonly seen in soap operas, which were, I believe without exception, always shot to tape. Television programming that was shot on tape will be just as smooth as that, because the temporal resolution of 60 Hz is maintained. In contrast, film is usually at 24 frames per second, even when used for television, so the motion won't be nearly as smooth. If you see a so-called cinematic frame rate for television programming, odds are that was shot on film. You might on rare occasions see something filmed at 30 frames per second, which is the frame rate I'm using with this camera, but I can't see much evidence of this being a thing. In the US anyway, most TV that was shot on film was done at 24 frames per second, and 3:2 pull-down was used to fit the 60 Hz refresh rate of television. Now, the refresh rate may not tell you the whole story. For instance, lots of times you'll find something online that was originally recorded in 60 Hz interlaced, but now exists as 30 frames per second progressive. So that can be hard to tell. But if you ever see the buttery smooth motion of true analog video, that's for sure on tape. Again, we're talking old stuff. People seem to increasingly like 60 Hz video these days, which, yeah, sure, whatever floats your boat. Another thing to look for are actual film artifacts. If you see specks or scratches, odds are that's film. Those sorts of things just don't happen on videotape. It's not like there aren't any artifacts at all with tape, but they're usually very minor and incredibly brief, at least on anything recorded professionally. And if you see any sort of grain in the image, that's film. Something recorded from tape wouldn't have grain to begin with, so wherever it's visible, that footage was, at some point anyway, on film. Note that digital noise can look sorta like grain, but you're not likely to see that on things produced professionally for television. Other caveat, dot crawl on analog videotape kinda looks like grain, but it's not that random. One of the easiest film artifacts to spot is known as gate weave. Because film traveling through a camera is a mechanical affair, the frame can't ever be perfectly aligned with each exposure. Slight misalignments in the camera's gate with the film from one frame to the next create a slight shakiness to the end result. So if the frame ever seems slightly unstable, there's a pretty good chance that was on film. A lot of modern film restorations have removed gate weave digitally, so this can't be entirely relied upon as a means to spot a film source. What do you mean this sounds dubbed in? This was totally recorded at the same time as everything else. A lot of television programming in the 60s, 70s, and 80s would use a mix of film and tape. Often you'd see tape being used in the studio and film being used for location shoots. One particular example is Monty Python's Flying Circus. Here, tape is clearly used whenever on set, and film is used whenever on location. A large part of this is simply down to the fact that video equipment was, for many years, huge, monstrous stuff that wasn't particularly portable. So for location shoots, a much less bulky, all-in-one 16mm film camera, and a sound guy on the side, will fit the bill just fine. In this case, it's easier to notice film artifacts because they used 16mm film and not 35mm. But even just looking for the difference in motion between studio sketches and location sketches will help you spot the difference. But the number one sign of something shot on tape is, it looks like it was shot on tape. Okay, this isn't helpful, I know, but honestly, you sort of get a feel for this after a while. Analog video is just kind of smooth and soft and fuzzy, and film just isn't. If you've seen a tape of something that was originally on film, like for instance a VHS tape of pretty much any movie, you'll get that smooth look, sure. But even there, you can often tell a film source from a tape source. It just has a look to it. Yeah, that's not helpful. Well, here, let's look at another example. Cosmos. Just like Monty Python, Carl Sagan was being shot on tape in the studio and on film when on location. Even though this is just from a VHS copy, you can definitely see a difference between the studio's video cameras and the film cameras. The huge asterisk on this video, of course, is that digital video in standard definition exists. Ever heard of DVDs? Those aren't analog, but they are still capped at the 480 lines that this thing uses. But now we have each of those lines subdivided digitally into 720 pixels. And in the professional realm, there were plenty of digital recording formats being used in the latter part of the standard definition era. So the tape look isn't everything, but the same limitations apply. So what sort of detail can we get out of something shot on film? Well, this depends on a whole bunch of factors, mainly to do with film stock. Just as consumers used to be able to pick between their Kodak Golds, their Fuji Chromes, and their dollar store brands, different qualities of film stocks were offered for use in motion pictures. Some were great, others not so much. Another thing about film that sort of hangs around even to this day is that faster films, meaning those more sensitive to light, tended to have physically larger film grains. So films used in low light scenes would have a grainier image, just like your camera today looks like crap when you turn the ISO up to 12,800. Which, by the way, that ISO is literally the same thing as the film speed you see on a film cartridge. Ain't that some fun history for ya? But if you want to come up with an average, you could argue that many 35mm motion picture films have an image roughly equivalent to today's 4K. But see, it gets tricky to even say that. Because the grain is random, if you want to digitize film and capture all its quality, you need to basically just increase the resolution until it doesn't seem to make a difference anymore. And at that point, you can say, well, the resolution is roughly this. But I think it's safe to say that only the worst film stocks would be incapable of producing an image that today we'd call full HD with 35mm film. If I were in charge, I'd say all film transfers should be done in 4K so that the best of the best can be seen to their full potential. And then of course there's other film formats like 16mm, which would probably rarely benefit from anything over 720p. Or 70mm, which you should probably scan in 8K. Or IMAX, which you should just give up trying. Film can hold incredible detail, and while that's certainly not always the case, I'd argue it's better to go a little overkill and capture more data than you need than to have to keep scanning the print every decade or so. That's the thing. Old film won't change unless, it degrades really badly. But our scanning techniques have and will continue to do so. One day we'll be able to get all the quality that we possibly can out of it. Perhaps we already have. But electronic signals on tape for television are just that. They're built to draw 480 lines on a CRT, to a standard that was set in the 1940s. And so long as that's the standard we're working in, that's what we're stuck with, and that's as good as it's going to get. But of course, here in the 21st century, we have the luxury of digital video, which is always perfect. Hey, so while discussing this topic on Twitter, I realized I should have added a little something to the script, which, I forgot to do. So here's me with a helpful postscript. A literal PS. Go figure. Anyway, this whole lots of TV was shot on film thing is the reason why oftentimes a Blu-ray re-release of something that was made for television actually makes sense. If you thought there was no point to something like that, well, you might be wrong. So long as the show was mastered to film before being transferred to tape, and those negatives or prints are somewhere in storage, a true high-definition remaster is possible. In the case of Star Trek Voyager, and shows like it, in theory, there could be an HD re-release. However, it would require duplicating essentially all of the post-production work, so it's a fair bet that won't happen. Plus, we don't even know if those negatives were kept. Something about giving your cardiac muscle as a Christmas gift and being distraught upon its subsequent... Nope. Already messed it up. Why did I keep going? I made a mistake. This was the only way we... They worked. All you needed to do... Those 480 line. 480. The best videotape... Yeah, no. The emphasis is all wrong.
I'm so stupid.